Joachim Horsley is a multi-talented, award-winning musician, composer, arranger, and producer. And he became a viral sensation playing Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, Movement 2, garnering over 10 million views and worldwide attention. He is among the very elite pianists who have been selected by Steinway and Sons as a Steinway Artist, a very high honor. And Mr. Horsley has crafted arrangements and orchestrated for popular musicians like Michael Bublé, John Legend, Ben Folds, and the Pet Shop Boys. And he has created the scores, listen to this, for over 50 film and television projects. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome one of the most gifted and talented, world-renowned pianists in the world, Joachim Horsley. Welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know, I've been looking forward to this interview, and I have been listening to your current album, Caribbean Nocturnes, and wow, what a spin on classical music.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, you know, where did this particular sound of yours come from?
So it came really from a trip to Cuba in 2015. I met up with a friend of mine, a drummer from Montreal who had a workshop. His name is Aldo Maza, and he invited me down to Cuba through his program to study with Afro-Cuban musicians and listen to music there, attend a festival. And this was in 2015. I was already working in Hollywood as a composer and arranger for film and television, but I really had always had a passion for Latin music, specifically Afro-Caribbean music. And I was really interested in learning more. And having studied Cuban music and other Caribbean rhythms from the United States, I'd never had the opportunity to go to Cuba. As, of course, you know, it's challenging, right? With the embargo, it's difficult to get down there. But you can go there to study. And so this is the first time I was able to actually go to Cuba. And what really started the project was I realized there was this cultural treasure in the Caribbean, in Cuba, that I really wanted to explore. And one way to do that was take something that I was very familiar with, which in my case is classical music, because that's my early training is in classical music, and do conversions of different rhythms, you could say, from different parts of Cuban culture, right? So that's how Beethoven in Havana, which is essentially rumba and timba styles combined with Beethoven, came to be. And then soon after that, I really figured, well, obviously, if there's treasures like this in the Caribbean, just in Cuba, there's got to be an enormous amount of musical treasure in other countries like Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and Venezuela, of course. And of course, that's true. So after making Beethoven in Havana, I really sought to seek out musicians from these different amazing Afro-Caribbean cultures and do fusion projects with them. And I've been doing that ever since. And the most recent result of this project is Caribbean Nocturnes, the album that I just released this fall.
Well, is this, you know, for all of my viewers and listeners out there that, you know, a lot, you know, we have so many pop stars and rock stars and country and all of that. But when it comes to classical music,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very tight community, very
Yeah.
tight listenership. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
how would you classify your album? Is it classical? Is it pop classical?
Yeah, I would say the best way to say is it's simply a fusion project. And when you say fusion, it just to me it says we're just taking something from one beautiful style and another beautiful style and we're mixing it together. So that's really all I can say. But I think the effect is that it's essentially Latin dance music with classical melodies and classical harmonies. So that's really what it is. And so of course it can work on a classical station that wants to veer a little bit outside the box, and it can work on a Latin music station that wants to veer a little outside the box. At least that's what I hope, right? So,
Well,
but yeah, I mean, you touched on one of the challenges actually, because it's by definition non-categorical, right? Like we're trying to do something that's really different. So sometimes it's a little strange, and people are like, I don't know what to do with this music, and that is a challenge. But on the other hand, right now in the world we live in, I think that there's more opportunities than ever to stand out, especially with social media, putting your music on social media. So I've just decided to double down on doing my own thing and kind of creating my own lane, for better or for worse.
well, see, I love that. Playing outside a musical genre, you know,
Yeah.
there's so many genres today that become uh, bland in the fact that everybody starts sounding the same.
Sure.
But your music stands out because as I was listening to the album, and I even went back to listen to the other music that you had written and created, and very dance oriented is this
Hmm.
the newest album, which
Yeah.
is really because you're listening to it and you're like, yeah, you get the groove, you can
Yeah.
feel it. Uh, and your music, I mean, if
Hmm.
your music could be created as a visual, it's
Hmm.
extremely colorful,
Thank
and
you.
and it's a happy emotion. Even one of the slower songs on the album uh,
Yeah.
was not slow to the point of being, let's say, overly dramatic, not
Hmm.
sad in any sound whatsoever. It was
Right.
just calming in a
Yeah.
way, and it was very romantic in its
Yeah.
sound.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. I really love the romantic melodies of the classical era. You might be talking about one of the songs in the album Lacrimosan, which is taking from Mozart's Requiem Mass, and that the Lacrimosa piece from that, and which is a melody a lot of people know, and putting it in a Cuban style. Son Montuno, Guajira, and Cha 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 show up in that particular arrangement. And the whole idea with that is actually it's to get the fusion. I think it's more than just combining styles. I really like to think of it as combining two different mindsets. And the way I think of it is like this: classical music has its origins in old Europe, in the Christian church, you could say, right? So, of course, the music is kind of built with harmonies and melodies as if they're reaching up to a god up there, right? That's kind of the idea. Now, on the other hand, a lot of the rhythms in the Caribbean, of course, come from Africa. And with that comes religions like Yoruba traditions, where the deities are in the earth and the ocean. So, what's really important in that music is dancing and improvisation on a low drum, because that gets you closer to God down there. So, by combining these two styles, it's really two kind of world outlooks of the people that originated this music. And to me, that's really interesting. As an arranger and composer, you're always looking for contrast. So, in that particular arrangement, what I am really trying to exploit is to get the listener to really feel that there's these two different, you could say, existential philosophies that are coming through in the roots of the music. So that's kind of the experiment, to see if it works and see if that push and pull as you're listening to it, even if you're not aware of this kind of cultural background, of course you can enjoy it anyway. The hope is that that creates a really interesting contrast and kind of involves the listener in a way that they're not even aware they're being, you know, involved, right?
And,
So that's
and
the
I
idea.
and I co- I 100% agree with that. It was so funny because even today, uh, when I enter the studio here, I always seem to gravitate to music or songs that kind of start my day, kind of starting off low and then finally building
Hmm.
up when I
Hmm.
decide to leave. But it was
Yeah.
funny this time because I put your album on,
Uh-huh.
and the first song is just like bam in your face. Uh, let's get happy, let's get energized, let's start
Right.
getting into the groove, let's start moving. And I'm just sitting here going, okay. And I had already listened to the album many
Yeah.
times before, but in the morning, because most of the time I'm listening to it, it's like in the afternoon, late afternoon, when
Right.
you're completely awake and ready to go. But in the morning, I
Hmm.
was like, wow. And I was like, okay. And what is crazy is that even the style of music is so upbeat, so happy, so joyous in its sound. I don't know. I think it just energizes one in a whole different way, even when it's the first thing you hear in the morning. And
That's
you know,
great. I'm glad to hear you got that effect.
it's definitely a Grammy award winning type album, and
Wow,
you
thank
just
you. Yeah.
literally just nailed this type. And this is your wheelhouse because I understand that you got to take us back a bit because I
Yeah.
understand that when you were 8 years old, you first heard Graceland by Paul Simon. What did that
Right.
do for you?
Right. So my dad, his generation, I think everybody of his generation loved that song, You Can Call Me Al. I mean, my dad's name was Alan. I remember we were driving back from my cousin's house in Connecticut. I grew up in Boston, and he bought the tape at a gas station, and I'd never heard anything like this. So I was just a suburban kid in Brookline, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and I'd never heard African music, not to mention Paul Simon was, you know, doing the way he was approaching the lyrics and what the songs were about. So it kind of blew me away. And ever since then, I felt a desire and interest in music that was, from a different place than where I was from, because it always seemed more interesting if the music was coming from Africa or the Caribbean. And so that led to a real search of all these different kinds of cultural music that ends up being, what I'm working on now, which is Afro-Caribbean music. And I think what really excited me in particular about that record, and why that made such a big impact on me, is because I think that if Paul Simon hadn't made that fusion effort with music, in that case, musicians from Africa, on the next album, musicians from South America and the Caribbean, if he hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had the exposure. So I've had the belief that if I'm making fusion music, maybe people who know classical music or people who know Latin music but don't know classical music, so people know classical music and don't know Latin music and vice versa. If I'm making this fusion, maybe there's people out there who will enjoy having their mind expanded in that way. So I feel like Paul Simon sort of set the bar when he went on that adventure. Now
Yeah.
it's crazy because in some way that album was really controversial, right? Like there were lots of problems with how he got the rights with the musicians, and in some cases he may have taken really advantage of them, which is a shame. So obviously we're not trying to do that part. We're trying to do the part where we're
I
bringing.
know. But
Yeah,
he brought something to popular radio
he did. Yeah.
that stood out. And of course, everybody fell in love with the
Hmm.
music video, which really
Right.
set that song even further apart. But it was the
Exactly.
beat. And like you said, it's that
Yeah.
African beat that people keep listening to. And I love
Exactly.
that because a lot of artists today don't step out of the box. I mean, I
Yeah.
loved it back in the day when Stevie Ray Vaughan brought true blues to
Hmm.
radio. It's something that,
Right.
that was always shoved off to the side if you were in the Delta. But
Right.
to be on the
Right.
radio and then finally be on MTV, that was massive. But then with
Yep.
Paul Simon, and this is what I love about Paul Simon. He's
Mm.
not afraid to try new things.
Yeah. Yeah. He absolutely. He's absolutely adventurous, and it's great. And I look up to that ideal, and that's really kind of the attitude I try to take. I have to push and push. So on the first album I did, it was mostly Cuban rhythms and a few collaborations. I really wanted to collaborate with more Caribbean musicians on this record, which is why I met up with Jen Del Tambo and Orito Cantora, who are two amazing Colombian, Afro-Colombian musicians, and they joined me on a piece called Colombia Andante, which is Mozart fused with Colombian rhythms. And we did a piece called Martinique Nocturne, which is a special collaboration with my drummer who I tour with in France, who's from Martinique, who introduced me to all the beautiful French Caribbean rhythms that we've been working on together. And so we made Martinique Nocturne, which is Chopin in a zouk style, and begin these old French Caribbean, you could say, from Martinique and Guadeloupe, these rhythms. So I'm really interested in exploring these different, you could say, Afro cousins in the Caribbean, and meeting musicians who are from these cultures and working with them. It obviously is super deep in every category. I have to eat a very good diet if I'm going to be living long enough to understand all this stuff. But what I'm really enjoying is these different collaborations with these different Afro perspectives. To me, that's what it's all about, trying to make this fusion kind of work. And I hope that when people hear the music and maybe they recognize the classical melody, it provides them an access point. If they're not familiar with, say, Martinique music, they can kind of get into it through this, because they can see how the adaptation takes something that they're familiar with and brings them just a little bit outside of their own comfort zone. So I think a lot about Anthony Bourdain and what he did. He's another guy I really look up to, in the sense that I thought he was a great ambassador, and what he did with food, that's kind of my aspiration to do with music in a way. Bring it, go to different cultures, have those conversations, and just have fun bringing it together, and everybody gets to learn a little bit. That's what it's all about.
Well, see, now you've just planted the seed out there, and I can literally visualize you doing an Anthony Bourdain type of television show based on music found around the world. I would literally watch that. I
Yeah, I
would
think
love that.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I would love to make a show like that. I think we kind of need a show like that. But look, food and music, right? Those are the two things. It's the easiest way to get to know somebody new, right? Nobody's having an argument when they're dancing. You know what I mean? That's when you can. That's when you get together, and it's like that with food too. I live in LA here. We have lots of different food. I'm always the one who's like, "Hey, let's go to this Ethiopian place. We got to try this new thing," and it's always kind of neat to be able to to branch out and find new things through food and music. So yeah,
Yeah, and
so
it's
I'd
like
love to do a show like that.
yeah, because I always say it is music that makes the world go around. It is music that makes memories. Food can too, because especially when you have a
Totally.
group of people fellowshipping
Hmm.
together, having fun, trying new things, but then
Hmm.
even having music playing in the background. But
Yeah.
what I want to ask you is that let's say you went down to the Caribbean
Yeah.
and you're studying their type of music.
Hmm.
When you're listening to their music, were there pieces of classical popping into your head that were matching up? Was it the rhythms? Was it chord progressions?
Yeah.
How did the meshing effect actually happen?
Well, that's a great question. So, well, I'll say it like this. When you study a composer, let's take Beethoven, for example. He's a very famous classical composer. I think even if you're not a huge classical music fan, you have a sense of the personality of Beethoven, like bold, brash, revolutionary musician, right? And that attitude is really in his music. And when you play his music, you have to really think about the attitude. Any good teacher will tell you it's not just reading the notes, you got to get into the mentality of what's going on with the guy who wrote the music. Now, my project, what it does, it imagines if instead of in Beethoven's case, if he was writing from Bonn or Vienna, he was in Havana. So, what would happen differently if his cultural surroundings were Cuban, if his realities were those realities of the Africans who were free after slavery and created rumba music in the early 20th century, and the reality of how they made their music? How would that have influenced Beethoven? And I think it's a great question because ultimately what I'm trying to do is not necessarily preserve every nuance of the classical piece, but rather the attitude of the composer that led to that, and try to give it sort of like an environment of Havana. And so, of course, this means adapting the rhythms and all these technical things that I have to do to work it out. But at the end of the day, it's all about the attitude of the composer. I think that's the difference between people who wrote music that kind of died out in its time period and the ones who were everlasting. Let's say Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, these guys. Basically, they're still household names, even if you don't know the music. The reason that music stuck around is because they had an attitude that was there. And so that's what I'm trying to preserve, is really the attitude. So when I feel like there's a piece where it really feels like it's just bubbling with uh, sabor from the Beethoven, right, with the flavor of Beethoven. And if you can mesh that with a rumba rhythm or maybe something from Colombia, like a cumbia rhythm, if it works and it feels like the attitude you can still capture that attitude of the original without without destroying it. So I guess another example would be if I have lots of arrangements that just don't work, and like this is like a whole experiment. And usually the ones that don't work are the ones where it becomes kind of like, remember the XFL? Everyone hated it because it was a combination of pro wrestling and football, but it took the worst of both worlds. Sometimes that when you work on things that happens. So we're trying to get the best of both worlds, right? That's really what it comes down to.
See, and you said something that that I've heard from top actors and actresses. And they've always said that if you want to be an actor, you need to get educated. Not
Yeah,
actually in the craft. You need to get educated in what's going on around your world. What's going on
true.
in the news? What
Yeah,
music are you listening to? Read things you know nothing about so you
right.
can understand that if you ever come across a part, you know how to bring all those things you've learned and any types of experiences into that piece. And with the way that
Okay.
you're explaining this, if Beethoven actually went to Havana or Cuba and sat there and listened, what would his music actually sound like? Because we're all sponges, which means, especially for those in music like you're absorbing your environment around you, and then it becomes something brand new. that comes out of you, especially for you coming out of your fingers upon the
Yeah.
keys.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The best actors, they do a ton of research. And that is a mentality when you work in film. I work as a film composer, and oftentimes I'm asked to write styles of music that I'm not particularly familiar with. And it requires me, of course, to collaborate with other musicians, but also take a deep dive in what's really going on. When you make music for a film, you are kind of playing a role as a composer. If you've got a film that takes place in a far off land, or it takes place about a person who's having a psychological experience, you have to select instruments and a palette and a direction and a vibe that really feels like the world that's there. So you have to sort of become like an actor and really start to transform yourself to do it successfully. So I think I do take that approach with this music. This is almost like its own story. Another thing I'll say is that some of the best scores and some of the best movies, they leave you kind of lusting for the legend of the thing. Like, when we first saw Star Wars before the prequels were created, and Obi-Wan Kenobi says, hey, I did fight in the Clone Wars, and Luke's really impressed. All of us as kids are watching it. We're like, wow, what are the Clone Wars? But that's all the information we got at the time. So all of us were just dying for 20 years to see movies about the Clone Wars. So that's what I think you want to do with music. You want to give people this sense of legend. You want to make them feel like if they're hearing Mozart in Colombia, you want to make them imagine like what it was like. You want to be able to taste it and smell it and wonder, what if this Vienna guy was in Colombia living there and his reality was more like Barranquilla instead of Vienna, right? And so
Yeah.
to me, that's kind of what you're going for. We're playing these roles and trying to really bring people into this, alternate universe.
Well, kind of walk us through. You mentioned
Sure.
scoring a film, and
Hmm.
music plays a very emotional role in
Yeah.
a film. Not just the emotion that the actors are trying to portray for their characters, but it's the music bed that sets the tone. We all know what happens when we hear the sound in the movie Jaws. Something really bad is about to happen. And
Exactly.
but so kind of walk us through that. If you're sitting in front of a film, do they send you the film that is
Hmm.
literally just blank, and you have to sit there and literally watch it and just figure out,
Yeah.
where you
Well,
start? I mean, literally, how do you start something like that?
yeah, great. So it's always different, but generally, when you get a film or a TV show, you get a locked cut, and that means that all the timing of the thing is done. And that means that if it's a half an hour show, you've got a half an hour film in front of you, and the timing is there. And these days, in a lot of cases, before I even see it, it has to be tested and auditioned for producers. So there's temporary music, which we sometimes just call temp. And so this can be score of another composer. And usually, what happens is you sit down with the director or the producers, you watch it with the temp music, you talk about it. They say, oh, I like what the music does here. Can you do something like this? I don't like what the music does here. Can you do something like that? And you have this kind of what's called a spotting session, which is just means that you spot where the music starts and stops. But really, it's a session to talk about the philosophy of the movie and how music relates to that, right? And so when that meeting is done and hopefully everyone's communicating well and I understand what the director and producers are looking for, then I go home and I turn off the temp music and I watch it myself. And when I watch a film, the first thing I do is I just try to watch it and try to pick up on the internal rhythm that comes from the dialogue and the way the edit flows. And usually, if you watch a film without the music, you can tap your foot. And that's how you establish the tempo. So the real important thing, I think like 50% of the job is getting the tempo right, because the music has to be the right rhythm for what's going on screen, right? So if obvious example is if you have a big action sequence, it's probably going to be an up tempo thing, right? And if you have a dialogue where someone's telling his girlfriend that he can't ever see her again because he has to go overseas and it's incredibly dramatic, that's probably going to be slower. But it's also going to be slower because of the acting and the editing and the way the actors are moving their hands. So there's an implicit rhythm. It's almost like watching a ballet without the music. You see it, it's there. And if the editor is good, then usually the rhythm is really apparent. So once you tap into that fundamental rhythm, then you've got your starting point. And then you try to write your melodies and your harmonies and themes that away from the picture. So what I do is after I've done this and I've come up with some tempos, I try to take some time, get some fresh air, do something else, let it if I have the time, often the deadlines don't allow this, but if I have the time, I like walking around and just thinking about the piece, thinking about how it makes me feel, um, what's the subconscious message of the movie, right? And then trying to write a theme that I like to call like a pregnant theme. And this can be like 4 notes, 3 notes, and something that you can use throughout the picture. Like if you think of the Terminator, we just hear da dun dun da dun, right? Everyone knows that. As soon as you hear that, Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to come on the screen and start killing people. So this little piece of rhythm is so simple. It's like a child's piece of music, but it works great and it's exploded. That's why I say like a pregnant theme. It develops and grows throughout the picture, right? So that's like the ideal theme, something that's a really clear motive that you can kind of use throughout. And then, of course, when you get into the craft of laying it in with that tempo you've established for different scenes, it's all about clever arrangement, making sure that like in that Jaws theme you mentioned, that ba-bum, that it's very important where that is in the orchestra. It's in the lowest part. It hits a primal thing because of the register. And so frequency of music is something you're thinking about. In a horror film, this is the maximum example of how they exploit register and our primal feelings. Things are very, very high, and they drop down really suddenly with a jump scare or something like that. That's an extreme example of tying into our primal instincts of hearing extremely low things and extremely high things and sensing danger. Usually when things are in this middle frequency where we're talking, it's not as scary.
Right.
So that's just so that's like a real, bicycle ride through the process, I'd say.
Well, for you, let's say as a fan of
Mm-hmm.
movie or movie scores, to you, what do you think is the greatest movie score of all time?
That's really, really hard because I like different scores for different reasons.
Sure.
Um, uh, you know, that's a
I
really
always
tough
thought
one.
Chariots of Fire would be rated in the top three.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic score. Many of the scores by Ennio Morricone are amazing. Uh, Gosh, I mean, Cinema Paradiso is an amazing score. Um, I love all the spaghetti westerns that he did. Of course, I like John Williams. Those are like, to say John Williams is the best film composer is a little bit like saying you enjoy breathing air out here in Hollywood. But I think some of the films that he did that aren't as maybe as popular, like Memoirs of a Geisha or Catch Me If You Can. These are fantastic scores. Um, but yeah, I mean, those old spaghetti westerns by Ennio Morricone, to me, those are fantastic because they're way outside the box and they're almost comically obtuse with the instrumentation, but they really tell you a story that it just wouldn't work with any different kind of score. I
Well,
mean,
have you
that's a
ever
real storytelling. Yeah.
this is probably kind of a funny question in a way. Um, have you ever heard of an amazing movie score that people should hear and listen to, but they won't because the movie is so bad?
Yeah, I think it happens all the time. I think a very good score. Um, I think it happens all the time. Actually, I mean, let me think of an example where I'm trying to think of an example of a score that was really good, but the movie wasn't quite as successful. I mean, you know, it's a tough one
Yeah.
because I think there are many movies that aren't as strong, but the music just did such an important thing. But generally, I feel like if the movie's really fantastic and the music's really fantastic, um,
It's a hit.
it's a hit. It's a hit. Let me think of a good example of a case. Um, well, a lot of the Bernard Herrmann scores with Alfred Hitchcock films, like I think the score for North by Northwest is amazing, but I think the movie's a mess. I mean, Hitchcock is a master, but that one was not a strong film. It's awkward. It's strange. You really feel like, well, does the characters seem to be doing things that aren't motivated? I think it's a sloppy movie, but the score totally makes it. And when that airplane is coming in to like land on the guy, the huge amount of the tension comes from that score. That's one of the most fantastically scored scenes in all of cinema, I think. But yeah, I think that's an example where, I mean, it's not a terrible movie, but it's certainly not as strong as I think Vertigo is, which is like a masterpiece. But that's an example, I think, where thank God he got the right composer for that one.
Well, yeah.
Uh,
Now, have you ever written a musical?
yes, as a matter of fact, I have. On the Disney Channel show Big City Greens, we've written a Christmas special musical, and I'm working on the Big City Greens movie, which will be a movie that comes out next year, and that's a full blown musical. So I'm writing the songs and the score for that one.
Oh, so you're doing the songs as well as the score. Well, I guess that would make
Yes.
sense because that way,
Yeah.
the rhythm is coming together, and what I would call the
Yeah.
colors are all matching and flowing throughout the whole film. So, wow, I
Exactly.
can't wait to see that.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild ride. That's a really beautiful family show on the Disney Channel that I love working on. Really creative guys. Those guys know how to make films. They know how to make films, and so writing music for them been a great collaboration for this last several years. Yeah.
Well, what is coming up next for you after this new album, Caribbean Nocturnes? What's next?
Well, we're going to keep making albums like this, I hope. And the next step is I've got some new music that's going to come out really soon. In January, I've got a new piece of music that's going to be called Carnival Capriccio, which is an original piece of music in a classical style, you could say, but it's the carnival rhythms of Colombia, Venezuela, and Martinique. And so in Portugal last May, I filmed the video with some of my musician friends from Colombia, from Venezuela, and Martinique, and we did a fusion piece of all three carnival rhythms in one. And it's going to be released in January, and we're looking to celebrate a carnival season. We haven't had a strong carnival season in a long time because of the pandemic, and now's the time where hopefully, fingers crossed, everyone's going to be in the mood to go out and have a great time and enjoy these amazing cultures and the carnivals they put on in February and March.
Now, do you tour often?
I tour as much as I can. Usually, I'm touring in France, and I have got shows coming up in early March. I'm going to France. Looks like we might go to Japan later this year as well. But we're still kind of collecting and setting up dates. It is a little awkward after the pandemic, I must admit, to book shows because my project was really just starting before the pandemic. So we're putting it back together, and we're getting out more and more. But yes, the goal is to tour and try to play in all these beautiful places. My wife says the project was just a Rube Goldberg way to go on great vacations to beautiful places.
That would work. When you
Yeah.
definitely have a better half, that really works out great for them. Now, where can all of my viewers and listeners know more about your music, and where can they buy it?
Yes. Well, you can go to joachimhorsley.com. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. It's always my name. I'm on Spotify, and of course, you can order CDs through my website, and also Amazon. You'll be able to get it. I think you can order the CD anywhere if you want to get the CD, but of course, we're streaming on all platforms as well.
All right,
So
ladies and gentlemen, take it from me. I listen to all of the music, and we only have the best on this show. And Joachim Horsley is one of the most gifted, most talented, world-renowned pianists in the world. But he's got a flavor like no other, and you have got to pick up the album, Caribbean Nocturnes. Take it from me. You're going to fall in love. And like I did today, turning it on first thing in the morning, wow. It hits you, fills you with joy. It gets your feet ready to dance. That's how we start our day. So check out JoachimHorsley.com. Now, is it JoachimHorsley.com? Did I get
that's
that
right.
right?
Yep,
All right.
that's right.
So, ladies and gentlemen, at the bottom of your screen, that's where you want to go, buy his music, and also look up any tour dates because you never know. If he comes near in a city near you, you have got to go watch him play. But more enjoyable than that, your ears will love every key he touches. So, Joachim, thank you so much for being on the
Thank
program
you.
today.
Really appreciate it. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, stick around because we're going to dance a little bit more. We'll be right back after this.
Thank you.